Hi again. In our last video, we looked at the growing anti-slavery movement in the North and the abolitionists who wanted to end slavery immediately and extend full rights to the former slaves. And as we even said in that video, that attitude didn't go over very well even with some white people in the North. So you can only imagine how well that went over in the South. So as I said, to be fair, we have to look at all angles of this slavery debate as we get closer to the Civil War. So in this video lecture, we're going to be fair and we're going to look at the South and let the South tell us why slavery is great. They'll defend slavery in their arguments, and it may not be as easy for someone living in the present day to go into this discussion with an open mind as it would be for us to look at arguments against slavery at the time, but we need to do it if we're really going to be fair and explore all the complexities of this country before the Civil War. The other thing we have to do in this film is, if we're going to see how Southerners are defending slavery, we have to take a closer look at what it is they're defending. We haven't really had a chance to talk about slavery itself in much detail. So I want to make sure we get a chance to do that here as well. And so as we do that, there's a way I like to get into any discussion of slavery to have you try to wrap your mind around slavery as an institution at the time. It's not something that, as I've said, will be necessarily familiar to you. So think of it this way. As we've said a few times, to a slave owner before the Civil War, a slave, who we would of course consider to be a human being, was property. A slave was property. A slave was an investment. A slave was something that you purchased and tried to get work out of, right? And so I want to show you something that I think is really eye-opening, always has been eye-opening to me. Check out these two documents that I put up on the screen. Take a minute to soak up what you're looking at. If you own a car, hopefully you have proof of insurance in your glove compartment in your car. That insurance is there because you're paying a little bit of money towards your insurance in the event that anything happens to your car, like an accident or anything hits it. You can get some help paying for the damages, get some remuneration. These are slave insurance policies on the screen. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what does. But there's another reason I'm showing you these. As you look at these slave insurance policies, I want you to take a look at the company that issued these policies. You see how both of them are from the Aetna Insurance Company, which, by the way, still exists today? Take a look at what state that company is from. Connecticut is a northern state. Connecticut banned slavery around the time of the American Revolution. There was no slavery in Connecticut in the 1800s. And yet, here's an insurance company in a free state that's issuing insurance policies on slaves. Remember last time we talked about the abolitionists who thought that the slave power ran the country, slave owners and their northern allies who benefited financially from slavery sticking around? Here's a prime example of it. These are insurance salesmen who are selling policies on slaves even though they live in a free state. So the whole country was tied up in this. We can't forget that. And so when an abolitionist like William Lloyd Garrison or Sarah Grimke or Frederick Douglass is criticizing slavery, honestly, guys, in the 1830s and 40s, your average American either didn't pay much attention to the issue or, frankly, supported slavery. Your average white American, if you want to be specific. And yet, these Southerners, slave-owning Southerners, find themselves forced to defend their institution, their way of life, against a growing chorus of critics across the country. And they're not just defending against abolitionists. Think about this. Not every white person in the South owns slaves. So slave owners have to defend slavery against white people who maybe don't own slaves and don't see any benefit to the institution. They have to defend against people in the rest of the world who are starting to be more critical of slavery. Remember that Great Britain ended slavery in all of its colonies in 1833? And guess what? I think they have to defend slavery against criticisms from the slaves and free African Americans. And they're going to tell us, Southerners are going to tell us, why slavery is great for all of those people. Why people who criticize slavery didn't know what they were talking about. And I want to walk you through some of their arguments, and we can discuss these further. Just as an example, one way to try to approach any defense of any relatively controversial institution, slavery is not relatively controversial, it was really controversial, is to try to approach the subject from an economic standpoint. Try to get people to understand, hey, you benefit in terms of your financial well-being just because we have this thing. We have slavery. There were a lot of Southern plantation owners and politicians who came up with this phrase. They called it King Cotton before the Civil War. And the whole argument about King Cotton was that slavery is growing all this cotton that is our chief cash crop, that is the king of the country's economy. And without slavery, we'd be really in trouble financially. Let's just put it that way. Now, I never make you memorize dates. I'm not going to make you memorize statistics, but I want to show you something I think is worth looking at. By the time you get to 1850, 11 years before the Civil War is going to break out, most of the Deep South is planted with cotton. It's one of the reasons, as we saw before, the factories and the industry were up in the north because Southerners wanted to save every last acre they could to plant cash crops like cotton and tobacco and sugar and rice. So you've got a lot of cotton fields in the South, and most of that is grown, of course, by slaves. So if you want to convince people that financially they're better off because of slavery, think about the financial impact of this. If 75% of all the world's cotton is coming from Southern plantations, then you can tell the rest of the world, hey, guess what? England, France, all these other countries that buy cotton from us, your cotton is cheaper because of slavery. We don't pay our labor. We don't pay our slaves. So we can sell our cotton to you for a lower price. If we had to pay our workers, like those northern factories do, we'd have to sell our cotton to you at a more expensive price. You wouldn't benefit as much. Heck, they start telling northern factories the same things. Your cotton that you're buying to turn into clothing and cloth in your textile factories is cheaper because we use slaves to harvest this cotton. And then they say, well, we're looking at the fact that so much of this is grown by slaves. They said, hey, let's bring up another number. While we're just talking numbers as far as reasons why slavery is great for the country as far as they're concerned. The last year of peace before the Civil War broke out, the stat that I just put on the screen is true. 95% of African Americans lived in southern states, in slave states. Only 5% of black people lived in the north. So a lot of Southerners who were defending slavery say, hey, William Lloyd Garrison, all you white Yankee abolitionists up there, you're criticizing slavery, but, and this is going to sound racist because it was, you're criticizing slavery, but you don't know how these people are. We live around these people. We know what they're like. That's how white Southerners would talk. Sometimes they'd even use possessive language. They'd use the word Negro. That was the common word back then. And they'd say, you don't know what it's like down here. We know how to handle our Negroes. They had that possessive sense about black people. Racist? Yeah, but that's how they felt. And so we know how to deal with this. I don't know if you remember, we talked earlier about how an earlier American, Thomas Jefferson, viewed slavery. Remember, he said it was morally evil, but he also said that slavery in America was like holding a wolf by the ears, right? You don't like it, but you dare not let it go. If you let go of that wolf, it's coming right for your neck. Well, these Southern plantation owners who are defending slavery are saying, look, if we end slavery, 95% of black people live down here in the South, we'd be in trouble. We can't do this. We have to hold on to slavery because it's financially a benefit for this country, and because these people down here need to be controlled. That's their attitude. And that didn't sit well with some people, but this is where they started the argument, was in terms of sheer numbers, like in terms of money and statistics. But that wasn't going to sway some people who had moral arguments against slavery. So they said, well, let's try something else. Sorry about that. Had a little computer glitch. So in terms of defending slavery and defending the South, numbers alone weren't going to cut it for some people. So Southern plantation owners said, well, okay, if you want to approach slavery from a moral standpoint, that's fine. We'll tackle that. If you want to talk about how we have to defend the whole region against this growing chorus of critics in the North, we can handle that too. There's a paranoia on both sides of this argument that by the 1830s and 40s have reached such a level that neither side was really willing to listen to the other side. You know what paranoia is, right? It's when you have this sort of irrational fear that people are out to get you, even if you can't necessarily prove it, or if it's not really justifiable. Well, guys, if you bear with me for a second, we have to take a look at something that's going on in the country by the 1830s that really made people in the South, especially Southern slave owners, feel like the North was out to get them. Just on the flip side, you remember that some Northerners felt like the South ran the country and had too much power. Southerners were equally paranoid by the 1830s and 40s. They believed that the North ran this country. And I want to give you an example. And this may seem bear with me for a second. It may seem like it's a bit of a tangent, like it doesn't really fit to this overall discussion of defending slavery, but we'll get it back into the story. We'll piece this together. So to do this, we got to take a step back, all right? I want to see if you guys remember something from an earlier discussion that we've had. Remember way back in the 1790s, we talked about something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. We talked about this really briefly in actually in our first video lecture, where people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed that law that said you could be thrown in jail for speaking out against the government. And they opposed that law using an argument called nullification. I don't know if you remember talking about this. So just to recap it, they said that they believed that since the state should be more powerful than the federal government, each state should have more power than the federal government, they said a state that doesn't agree with a law coming out of the federal government should be able to nullify that law or ignore that law simply by not enforcing it within their boundaries. Remember we talked about that before, where like Virginia said, we don't want to enforce that Sedition Act, so we're just going to ignore it. Now that's a debate worth having, and it's continued into the present day. It also continued into the 1830s and 40s. And I'll give you an example of where it popped up, all right? I'm sorry to have to talk about economics in so much detail, but it's going to help you get a sense of how paranoid the South was, how they felt like their entire way of life was threatened, okay? I don't know if you know what a tariff is. I'm sorry, talking about economic terms like this, I know it's not terribly exciting, so bear with me for a second. A tariff is basically a tax on anything that's imported or exported into or out of a country, all right? Well, a bunch of northern politicians in the late 1820s and early 1830s passed a whole bunch of tariffs, and I'll explain what's going on here, okay? They decided that they were going to make foreign countries pay more for things that they bought from the United States. For example, we'll stick with the example that's going to affect the most people. The government said, we're going to make foreign countries like England and France have to pay a tariff, have to pay a tax on any cotton that they buy from the United States. They're going to have to pay more for American cotton if they want it, right? Well, they passed this because they thought, rightly, if Britain has to pay more money for American cotton, do you think they'd buy as much? No, probably not. So if Southern cotton plantation owners can't sell as much cotton to Great Britain or to France, where are they going to have to sell it to? Oh, I know. They'll have to sell their cotton to northern factories. We can't sell as much of our cotton to England or Paris, so we're going to sell more of our cotton to a factory up in Boston or New York. These northern politicians passed these tariffs thinking, rightly, that it would benefit northern businesses, would benefit northern factories who would be able to buy more cotton, right? Southern politicians went crazy, saying this was proof that Northerners were out to get the South. They were trying to make the South suffer. Because if Southern cotton plantation owners really have no choice but to sell their cotton to the North, who gets to decide the price? It's not the cotton plantation owners, it's the Northern factories. Northern factories are going to benefit from this. Southerners are not. And at one point in the early 1830s, some powerful people in the state of South Carolina, including the Vice President of the United States, a guy who we'll actually see later named John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, who was Vice President of the U.S. in 1832 from South Carolina, argued that South Carolina was going to be so hurt by this tariff that they didn't even have to enforce it. They were going to nullify that law. They were going to ignore it in South Carolina. They were not going to charge the British and the French that tax. They were going to sell cotton to them at the old prices. This did not go over too well with the government. I don't know if you've heard of a guy named Andrew Jackson. You don't want to make Andrew Jackson mad. Andrew Jackson was president of the United States when this was all going down. Andrew Jackson sent the U.S. Navy to Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, pointed cannons at the shore, and said, you will charge this tariff or we'll blow you up. So South Carolina freaked out, they backed down, they got scared. But guys, 30 years before the Civil War happened, you've got a southern state, South Carolina, threatening to ignore the United States government. And you've got the United States government sending the military to a southern state to force them to toe the line. And so you can see the paranoia that's going on down in the South, that they feel like the government is in the pocket of Northerners and Northern business interests, all right? So here's the deal. If you feel paranoid, if you feel like your way of life is threatened, these Southerners had to find any other way they could to cement their control, to hold on to what they're used to. In this case, slavery and a system that puts them, as white people, at the top of the heap. So let me give you an example of something that they did. to defend slavery and really to make it stronger. Southern states passed something that they called slave codes. It's a whole series of laws that were designed to give white people in these states more power and to hold on to the power over slavery as an institution. For example, any white person in a state that passed these slave codes, I don't care if they were 17, male, female, 75, whatever. If you're white and you're walking down a street in a southern state after these slave codes were passed, and you saw a black man walking towards you, you had the right to walk up to him and demand to see his papers. And you had two kinds of papers you were supposed to carry if you were black in the 1830s and 40s. One was if you were a slave, you had to have a piece of paper on you that said you had your master's permission to be off the plantation. You're going into town to pick up some things from the store or whatever. The other one is if you were a free man, and there were free black people in the South, even during slavery, you had to carry what they called freedom papers to show that you were registered with the state government as a free person. So as a white man, you could walk up to a black man and demand to see his papers. And if he didn't have either his freedom papers or proof that as a slave he had permission to be off the plantation, you could grab him, take him to the authorities, throw him in jail, and get paid money for arresting him. You had that kind of power. You're setting up a system where you're trying to make all white people feel better off because they're not a slave. Because what they're doing is they're saying, hey, here's what we're forgetting in this country. Slaves are property. That's them talking, not me, all right? We've got to defend our rights to own property. And to do it, the southern plantation owners in the 1830s, 40s, 50s are going to launch a massive, let's call it what it was, a propaganda campaign, a PR campaign to convince the whole rest of the country and the world that slavery was great. And you had to start by changing people's minds about what slavery was. Because as we've seen, an earlier slave owner like Thomas Jefferson thought slavery was morally evil. That's how he phrased it, right? It's something that he thought we needed and couldn't get rid of, but he said it was morally evil. But now if you're going to convince people that they're wrong to criticize slavery, you've got to convince people that slavery is a good thing for everybody. There's positive, good things about slavery. And there's a couple ways they're going to try to do this. And I want you guys to see it. Right? This is where the rubber really meets the road. Let me introduce you to a white southern plantation owner by the name of George Fitzhugh. Fitzhugh is a writer. He's got some strong thoughts about why slavery is great. To defend slavery, he's going to take the approach of comparing slavery to the system that's getting stronger and stronger up in the North at this time. Remember, the North is starting to get all those factories, all that industry that we've talked about. And I've used this term with you before. Remember what free labor meant? If you're a free laborer, it means you chose to work. You choose to go to work. You can choose to quit, right? If you're a free laborer, you're not a slave. We've already seen how free laborers in northern factories didn't get paid a heck of a lot of money. So Fitzhugh is going to come out. He's going to tell us why slavery is fantastic, not just for the slave owners, but for the slaves themselves. Fitzhugh actually had the guts to say, before the Civil War, that slaves were treated better than factory workers in the North. And think about it, right? Remember, slaves are an investment. Slaves cost money. So Fitzhugh's going to say, look, we bought these people. He's calling people when he needs to, otherwise he thinks of them as property. We bought these people. We're going to treat them well. We wanted to get labor out of them. We need them. If you work in a northern factory, this is George Fitzhugh talking, if you work in a northern factory and you get sick or you can't come to work or you complain about your job and you quit, they're going to find a replacement for you. Factory work in the early 1800s wasn't very skilled labor. It didn't take a lot of training or education. So they'd say, look, you're replaceable. You're disposable. Complain about your job, fine, go home. We don't need you. We'll find somebody else to take your place. But a slave costs money, and a slave, according to George Fitzhugh, needs to be protected. So an abolitionist who says, oh, isn't it horrible how slave owners whip their slaves all the time? Fitzhugh would say, nah, they're overstating it. We don't beat our slaves that much because we need them to work. Yeah, he's telling you a line of, let's be honest, it's a bit of BS, but whatever. He's trying to convince people that slaves are great. We treat them really well. And you'll see the argument more. Fitzhugh even went this far. And this is controversial. But I've had students over the years who actually kind of agree with this point. I'm going to try to paraphrase what George Fitzhugh is talking about here. He says, look, we tell these northern factory workers that if they work hard, show up to work every day, maybe they'll climb the ladder, maybe they'll get a raise, maybe they'll get a promotion, and then someday they won't be living in some slum in Boston or New York City. Maybe someday they'll be able to afford a nice house. move to the country, raise children. We always tell them how they can climb up the ladder and fulfill that American dream. And Fitzhugh says that's not going to happen. Northern poor workers are going to stay poor because the owners of the factories want to keep them down. And you can agree with that or disagree with that, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest in modern day America that the gap between rich and poor in this country is getting wider all the time. So what Fitzhugh said was, we need to stop lying to the workers in this country. They're never going to get ahead. They can't survive on the wages they earn. We know what we're doing here in the South. We enslave our labor. We don't give them any illusions that they're going to climb up the ladder, because they never will. So let's just be honest about this. And all workers nationwide should just be turned into slaves, because that's what they are anyway. They can't really, Northern factory workers can't really quit their job. So he's saying, look, we treat our slaves better than you Yankees treat your workers. So don't talk about how great free labor is, because they're struggling to survive. He kind of had a point at the time. So Fitzhugh is saying, look, slavery is great for the slave. They're better off than Northern workers. Excuse me. So now let's take it to another point. To push this a little farther, what Fitzhugh is saying, check out a pair of illustrations I want you guys to see from before the Civil War. Josiah Priest was just another Southerner defending slavery, but his arguments kind of echoed what Fitzhugh was talking about. So if you see the top drawing here, here we've got a white factory worker in the North who got sick. Okay? Well, he can't afford a doctor. So you see these two guys, they threw him in a stretcher, they're taking him off to the poorhouse, off in the distance there. And it's not shown in the picture, but you've got to assume what they're going to do is they're going to take him to the door of the poorhouse and they're just going to drop him off. If he lives, he dies, they don't care. There's 100 other white guys who'll take his job in that factory right now. No worries. Check this out. And you can call this bogus if you want. But the George Fitzhugh argument says, look, here's what happens when a slave gets sick. We want him to get better. We need him back in that field. We can't just replace him because slaves cost money. Slaves aren't cheap. So we're going to nurse him back to health. So here's the slave owner sitting by the bed, holding his slave's hand. Oh, we want you to get better. Here's a white lady bringing him some tea or some soup or something. I mean, if you don't buy it, that's fine. I'm not sure I do. But this is the argument they're making, that our slaves are treated so much better. And I've had people in my classes write papers basically saying George Fitzhugh was onto something. It doesn't mean they're racist. It doesn't mean they want slavery. But these issues are more complicated than you might think at first glance. It's something to keep in mind. So if Fitzhugh and these guys are going to defend slavery from the slaves' point of view and say why they're better off, well, let's take a look at another group of people. Here we've got a South Carolina senator from the 1850s named James Hammond. And Hammond is just one of many white people who talk like this. I don't know if you remember an earlier discussion of something called Bacon's Rebellion from way back in the 1600s. Remember after Bacon's Rebellion, the authorities in these southern colonies started making slavery more and more based on African labor instead of the white indentured servants? They're trying to send a message to white people. And people like James Hammond tried to keep that message going as we got closer to the Civil War. The message was real simple. Look, hey, white people, I know that a lot of you are poor. Excuse me. You don't have a lot of money. You're living in shacks up in the hills. But guess what? You're white. And in the South, before the Civil War, the message was clear. We have black people as slaves. They're down here on the bottom of society. All white people are elevated. This brings us all together. You could be real poor, but it could be worse. You could be a slave. The message was from a guy like James Hammond. They actually had quotes saying things like, it doesn't matter how poor a white man is. He is not a slave. He is not from the inferior race of people. Because, you know, of course, they believe black people to be a completely inferior race at the time. So he stands on the same social platform. The poorest white man and the richest white man are equals in the eyes of the South. If you're not buying it, I get it. But that's the argument they're putting out there. Because I want to show you just how few white people in the South before the Civil War actually own any slaves. Guys, check it out. If you've ever seen any Hollywood movies set during the time of slavery, they have the stereotypical images, you know, a big plantation with dozens, if not hundreds of slaves working out in the field, right? The big plantation mansion with the owner rocking back and forth on his porch drinking some tea or something. Most Southern slave owners didn't own that many slaves. And most Southern white people didn't own any at all. Check this out. I don't want you to obsess over the numbers, but I just want to show them to you. Get this. Only a quarter, 25% of any Southern white people owned any slaves at all. That means 75%, 3/4 of all white people in the South had 0 slaves. It's a massive amount. It's not the stereotypical image of the South. Most white people didn't own any slaves. And then, get this. If the image is, oh, big plantations with hundreds of slaves, let's break it down even farther. Of the 25% of white people in the South who owned any slaves, watch this. Only 12% of all slave owners had 20 slaves or more. So if we do the math even farther, what that really means is only 3% of all white Southerners owned any slaves at all. Or sorry, I said that wrong. Only 3% of all white people at all had 20 slaves or more. Only 12% of slave owners had 20 slaves or more. So really, guys, the big plantations that you think of in Hollywood, that was the exception. That wasn't very common. Your average slave owner only had a few. They're still owned slaves. I'm not saying it makes it okay. But guys, your average slave owner had 2, 3, 4 slaves. He owned a small farm and he had some slaves there to help him do the labor. You still own slaves. You still own people, right? But what you've got is a huge amount of poor white people in the South who, even if they wanted to own slaves, couldn't necessarily afford them. Slaves were expensive. So what you've got in the South, let's just be really offensive for a second. If I asked you to think of all the negative, nasty slang terms you could think of for poor white folks, you'd probably think of a word like hillbilly, maybe, or let's be even more brutal, cracker, redneck, white trash. All those labels existed in the South before the Civil War. There were a lot of poor people in the South. Let's just be honest. Heck, there still are. They couldn't own any slaves, and trying to convince those poor white people that slavery was great was a tough sell. You try to sell it to them by saying, well, hey, you're white, so you're better off. Try to make them more racist. And that's something that people have always tried to do, is to get, say, poor black people and poor white people fighting against each other so that they forget that they're all sort of in trouble on the bottom of society together. And if they realize that the people up top are there to make sure they stay down there, they might come together a little more, which is exactly what the people on top don't want. But I digress. The thing is, guys, these poor white Southern folks, a lot of them lived in the Appalachian Mountains, places like Western Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee. Those people, when the Civil War came along, they didn't even necessarily support the South's cause. Some of them actually openly fought for the North or the Union during the Civil War. We'll see that later on. We'll talk about that more down the road. It's something for you guys to keep in mind. It's really crucial, okay? Because the South that we're looking at, something that we need to acknowledge, was getting more and more separate from the North in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of their economy, in terms of their culture. There's an old saying that applies not just to the economy, but it works here. The old saying is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. The South's eggs were in one basket. Slave-based plantations growing cotton, tobacco, sugar, things like that. With cotton, every year people say, we want more of it. Factories in the North want more cotton. Other countries want more cotton. So, as we've said before, if you have a growing demand for cotton, and you say, well, I want more slaves. Oh, and if I'm going to grow more cotton, I need more land, right? So the more land you fill with cotton, the less acreage there is available for cities, for factories. Almost all the factories are in the North. We've seen that, right? And so there's not a lot of skilled trades in the South. Most people worked in farms. They either owned plantations or they worked on farms. That was pretty much the way of life in the South. It's rural, there's small towns, there's little villages, very few big cities. Guys, of the top 10 cities in America in terms of population before the Civil War, only 2 of them were in slave states. Baltimore, Maryland, and New Orleans, Louisiana. That's it. Every other major city in the country was in the North. Southern cities like Richmond, Charleston, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, these were all pretty small compared to northern cities before the Civil War, because there was no incentive for the cities to grow. You put your cotton on a train or on a ship, more often on a ship in a port like New Orleans, you send it up to the northern factories and that's it. You don't make it there yourself. And speaking of railroads, there really weren't a lot in the South. Most of the railroads were in the North to connect the northern cities and the northern factories to ship things to the people. But the South, not a ton. And if you think about how this come back to bite the South during the Civil War, you don't just move things on trains during war. What else do you move? people, soldiers, reinforcements. It's going to make it hard for the South to wage war without a lot of railroads. And the last factor in this, guys, most Southerners were told, you don't need much education. You're going to just work in a farm, or, you know, maybe if you inherit money, you might own a farm. There's a lot of illiteracy in the South. There's not a lot of education. And there's not a lot of opportunity. If you're poor and white and Southern in the South and you don't buy the argument that slavery is great, well, it's easy to understand why. As we said before, if you're like a farmer, a white farmer in the South, you can't compete with a plantation that can grow their crops in so much higher numbers and charge less for their crops. You can't compete with that. So if you can afford to, you're going to get out of the South. Guess where you're going to go? You're going to move up north, trying to get a job in a northern city. And one of the other things that sets the North and the South apart, straight up, as we've said before, is population. I've told you this number before, I'll say it again. By the time we get to the Civil War, you're going to have 23 million people living in the North. Only 9 million people in the southern states. And of those 9 million, 4 million were slaves. That's a big difference. But the South didn't see any reason to change because they thought, hey, their way of life is thriving. That's what they thought. They're going to get a rude awakening. But the thing is, the people in charge of this system, the plantation owners or planters for short, who control most of the wealth in the South, of course, they don't want things to change. They're doing great. They're rich. They're comfortable. They have a whole bunch of slaves doing labor for them. They're raking in the money because of cotton or tobacco or whatever they're growing. And their attitude was basically, everyone should thank us. Everyone owes us respect. There's a word I want to use here, paternalism. One way to think of it is if you take a paternal attitude towards someone, it's kind of like you're a father figure or a parental figure, right? And if you think about what most people would say is a parent's responsibility toward his or her kids, you have to take care of them. You have to feed them. You have to provide for them. But you also have to be an authority over them. You have to make them realize, look, if you get out of line, I can discipline you. That's a parent's responsibility, whether you like it or not. And these wealthy planters who really saw themselves as like an aristocracy, as aristocrats. You know what an aristocrat is, right? A rich person who inherits land, who inherits a title, like, you know, the Duke of such and such back in England. A lot of these plantation owners saw themselves as aristocrats. They had inherited their land from their fathers, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers. Just as one example, if you haven't heard of Robert E. Lee, you will before this class is over. Robert E. Lee, probably the most famous Southern general in the Civil War, was a rich plantation owner before the war. His father was a rich owner of slaves, who also was a general in the American Revolution. Robert E. Lee's grandfather was a rich plantation owner who actually signed the Declaration of Independence at the start of the Revolution. So a lot of these wealthy aristocratic Southern families went back generations of power. And they felt like they were entitled to basically run the whole country. They believed everyone depended on them. And it starts, of course, with the slaves, right? Their attitude was that slaves were like children. They depend on us. They couldn't take care of themselves if we didn't take care of them. But beyond that, they said, look, our wives depend on us. We've already talked about, and we will talk more about, how women were treated as second-class citizens or worse in the South. But they also said, look, northern factory owners depend on us for cheaper cotton. People who work in northern factories depend on us for their jobs because we provide the cotton that they process. Europeans depend on us for the cotton that they buy from us. These planter aristocrats felt like the whole world owed them respect and obedience. And they were going to be in for a rude awakening because even some of their own wives were starting to give them crap before slavery ended. Here's the deal. I don't know if you've ever heard of the stereotypical image of the Southern belle, Southern white women who are supposed to be good Southern belles, right? There's a lot of movies that reinforce this, that they were supposed to be prim and proper and respectful and silent and submissive and all beautiful and dolled up and wear the big gowns with the hoop skirts and all that kind of stuff. Well, these Southern women have been conditioned for generations to be respectful of their husbands, obedient to their husbands. And they're in a situation where they're not supposed to speak their mind. They're certainly not joining that women's rights movement that was up in the North. And in fact, in the South, if you were one of these Southern belles, if you were the wife or the daughter of a plantation owner, you were less than nothing. You were less than a second-class citizen unless you got married. There are marriages in the South before the Civil War, they're like old medieval marriages. They were arranged between wealthy landowners. You know, they marry their daughters off to their sons and stuff. You're nothing without being married as a Southern belle. In fact, you want to freak out a little bit. If you were with me right now, I'd ask you to guess the average age of a Southern woman at her marriage, and it was about 15 or 16. Sometimes their husbands were in their 40s or 50s. Nasty. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, you be a 15 or 16-year-old Southern woman and you marry one of your dad's friends who needs someone to help him run the plantation because his wife already died and he needs a new wife, and it's arranged all like that. I once read a diary entry from a Southern woman named Kate Carney, and this is crazy to me. She was freaking out in her diary entry. It was her birthday. And she wrote, "Today is my birthday, and I am getting quite old for someone who is not yet married." And guess how old she was? She wrote that on her 17th birthday. Dude, 17th birthday, and she's freaking out about being too old to not be married yet. And if you want to get a window into the Southern woman's point of view and what they're criticizing, right, one great place to look, you know, we'll talk about, you know, primary sources in history and reading actual documents and eyewitness accounts from the past. Mary Chestnut, who's in this picture on your screen, she was the wife of a pretty wealthy slave owner in South Carolina. And her husband actually became a U.S. Senator for a while, too. Mary Chestnut kept a diary through her whole adult life, and that's a great window into the experiences of these wealthy Southern white women. And she wrote some diary entries about a practice that Southerners made up a term for. They made up this name, miscegenation. It's kind of clinical to talk about it. It was a fancy word for, how would they put it? I don't sound racist, but the way they would put it was interbreeding between the races was unnatural. That's how they put it. Miscegenation is just a fancy word for, you know, intercourse between a white person and a black person producing a mixed race child, which they thought went against the laws of nature. And I don't know if you've ever heard the actual term that they would use back then for a child who was half white, half black. They'd use the word mulatto. So Mary Chestnut has a diary entry where she's criticizing this practice of miscegenation. Because a lot of Southern women, they got angrier and angrier about slavery as the years went on, not because they thought it was wrong to own a slave, not because they were big believers in racial equality, but because they were angry at their husbands, because they knew darn well that their husbands were sneaking out to the slave quarters at night and, not to put too fine a point on it, having sex with slave women. Sometimes voluntarily, sometimes more often by force. And these Southern white women were not going to take it anymore. And Mary Chestnut wrote a diary entry that it just speaks volumes about it. I can quote it directly from memory. So here it goes. She said, "God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system, a wrong and iniquity. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all alone in one house with their wives and their concubines. And the mulattoes that one sees in every plantation at least partly resemble the white children. Every woman is ready to tell you who is the father of the mulatto children in every plantation but her own. Those, she seems to think, drop from the clouds." There's a lot going on in that quote. If you know what a concubine is, it's like a harem. You know, the old kings and whatnot used to keep a bunch of women on the side for their amusement. That's what Chestnut is saying white slave-owning men were doing. And the mulattoes in every plantation, the women are ready to say, "Oh, look at that plantation down the road. Look at those children. They look just like the master. We know what he's been up to." But she won't admit that her own husband might be doing the same thing, though she seems to think drop from the clouds. She's criticizing what these men are getting away with. So the cracks were starting to show. These white men are not just defending slavery against the slaves, free black people, white Northerners. They're defending slavery against their own wives after a while. So they're up against it, right? Not that we have to feel sympathy for them, but it's something that they're wrestling with. And while we're wrestling with slavery and its defenses, as I said earlier, to be fair, we have to look at what it is that these Southerners were defending. We have to look at slavery as much as we can to see what one of the arguments is going to be that's going to tear this country apart. So the thing we have to acknowledge about slavery before the Civil War is it's sometimes pretty tough to get some accurate depictions of life as a slave. And you can probably guess why. A lot of states made it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. That was another one of those slave codes that we talked about. To hold on to power for white people. You couldn't even teach your slaves how to read and write in some states. You wouldn't want them to get any information, right? So if you can't read and write, it's hard for you to produce a lot of documents of what it was like as a slave. I mean, we have testimonials of former slaves, But a lot of the written accounts of slavery come from white slave owners. So you can imagine how biased those are going to be. We can still piece together a little bit. We can piece together accounts from people like Frederick Douglass, from former slaves who wrote and talked after they left slavery or after slavery was abolished about their experiences. And I'll tell you what, if you want to sum up life as a slave on a cotton plantation, there was a saying that they used to use. It said, when you're a slave, each day you work from can to can't. From can see in the morning until can't see at night. As soon as the sun comes up, you're out there in the fields. You work until you can't see anymore. When the sun goes down, you're done. It's too dark. Unless there's a full moon. If there's a full moon, you can still see. Keep on going. And you're out there with the overseer on horseback, cracking the whip, forcing you to do all this backbreaking labor until the day you drop. And you start this at a super young age. There was an old slave saying, it said a slave child starts working when they're knee-high to a duck. When you were 3 or 4 years old, if you were a slave, the master would have you carrying buckets of water out to the field or helping to bring bales of hay in for processing. When you were about 8, 9, 10 years old, you went out in the fields working next to your parents for the rest of your life. That was it. That was your existence. Only 3% of any slave ever made it to the age of 60. It's backbreaking work. Not easy. And the thing is, when you look at the stereotypical image of slavery, there are different jobs, there are different tasks. You've probably heard these terms before, right? A field hand, like the name implies, works in the field, planting, harvesting, processing the cotton or the tobacco. The house slave works in the house as a domestic servant, a butler, a nanny to the slave owner's children, a maid, things like that. And there was even divisions between the field hands and the house slaves. House slaves obviously had, less backbreaking manual labor, but they were also always under the watchful eye of the family. Field hands had brutal labor, but sometimes they were able to develop a somewhat separate culture away from the watchful eye of the master and his family. When the shift is done, when the day of labor is done, you're in the slave camp, but you can stay up, you can tell stories, you can sing songs, you can play music. House slaves didn't have that luxury, and they had a rivalry. And when you talk about slave culture, you also have to acknowledge trying to develop a culture as a slave is a challenge. Slave families could be broken apart like that. It was all too common, as horrible as it is to think of, for slaves to watch as their children were sold off and never see them again. If you were married as a slave, it was pretty common, sometimes just to show you who was boss and to keep you docile. The master would sell your spouse, and you may never see him or her again. Slave marriages, of course, in the South were not legally binding. There was no legal recognition of slave marriages. They actually used to change the vows in a slave marriage. Now, a traditional wedding vow says, until death do us part. In the slave marriages, the vow was until death or distance do us part. It's pretty sobering to think about. But you're still struggling. You still try to hold on to a community. You still try to form a culture. And in slavery, actually, some southern states tried to make it illegal to teach slaves Christianity because they thought it might plant ideas into their head. If you read the New Testament and Jesus talking about how everyone's equal in God's eyes, that challenges the whole idea of slavery. But there were passages in the Old Testament that talk about how slaves need to be obedient to their masters, and some masters would try to enforce that on their slaves. But sometimes slaves, just as resistance, would hold on to West African religious customs that had been passed down to them by generation from their ancestors that had been first brought over on the boat from Africa. Anything you could do to resist the master's ability to completely dehumanize you, you would do. And to resist, you start small. You might pretend that you don't speak English. You might pretend that you're sick. You might sabotage the tools. You might get punished. But anything you can do to slow things down, you'll do. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe you want to run away. I'll tell you, actually, the most common form of slave escape was something they called lying out, which didn't mean running away and hooking up with the Underground Railroad and going to Michigan or Canada. It meant running off from the woods into the woods and hiding out in the forest or in the swamps or on the plantation for a couple of days, fully intending to come back in a few days. But in those few days, that's a couple of days of work that the master didn't get from you. And of course, you'll be punished. Well, a lot of slaves said, hey, it's worth it. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe you're not happy just breaking a shovel or hiding out or running away. Maybe you're really angry. Maybe you want to fight back. Maybe you want to organize a rebellion. Guys, by the 1830s and 40s, slave rebellions were picking up steam. They were getting more and more common, more violent. White people were terrified of these things. We'll see one in a second. Whatever you do, though, whatever your form of resistance, you will probably be punished if you're caught. And I want to brace you. There's a picture I want to show you. It's hard to look at. It's not easy to see. If I took this picture of this slave with all the scars from all these whippings that you see on his back, I could show this picture to two different people before the Civil War and get dramatically different reactions from them. Imagine you took this picture to an abolitionist rally up in Boston. Hold this up to an abolitionist. Oh, they're going to say, look, this proves how evil slavery is. Look how we're treating our fellow man. We're treating him like an animal. We're beating him like an animal. Slavery is savage. They're not savage, the slave owners are. That's how they put it, right? But then, take this picture, show it to a slave owner. Show it to George Fitzhugh, who talked about, the slaves being treated so well. And say, hey, Mr. Fitzhugh, doesn't this prove you a liar? He'd say, no. All this proves is that this slave didn't know his place. He forgot to be obedient. If he had just been obedient and known his place, this never would have happened. Slavery keeps everyone in their proper relationship. And yeah, like a good parent, we have to discipline our dependents when they act out. So all this says to me is that's a bad slave. That's what a guy like George Fitzhugh would say. I know where I stand on this picture. I bet you do too. But you can see the dramatically different reactions to something like that as the arguments over slavery picked up steam, especially because slave owners were getting more and more afraid of not only slave uprisings, but of the power of growing northern movements like the abolitionist movement. And I'll give you an example of where some of this really came together. If you can't see that, it's 1831. That's what it says on the screen. I don't care if you know dates, but just so you know roughly when this was. The single most violent slave uprising in American history was orchestrated by just a field hand. I say just a field hand, that's offensive. But he was a field hand. He wasn't formally educated. He didn't have a lot of connections. He was a field hand on a plantation in Virginia. He believed, if I can use a fancy phrase, that God had ordained him. Ordained means chosen or sanctioned by God. God had ordained him to free his people. This is what Nat Turner believed. And so he started working with this network on his plantation to orchestrate a group of slaves who were going to help him in his rebellion. And then once they rebelled from their plantation, they were going to go on a rampage through the rest of the South and strike at the heart of slavery and fight back. And so one night in the fall of 1831, there was an eclipse, a lunar eclipse. And Turner took this as a sign from God that now was the time to strike. He and his network slaughtered the entire family on the plantation of the master and rampaged throughout Virginia, killed about 60 white people as they fought their way through Virginia. Brutal. This was the wolf being let go that Thomas Jefferson had feared, right? The Virginia State Militia organized response to this, and in trying to track down Nat Turner, killed 120 African Americans. They caught Turner eventually. They hanged him in November of 1831. And I think what's worth mentioning is Nat Turner was turned in by a slave. He wasn't caught by the white state militia. He was turned in by a slave who was working in the field one day and looked up in the forest and saw Nat Turner. He was turned in by one of his own people because this slave was afraid of what would happen if his master found out that Turner had been near the plantation and no one had spoken up. He was hoping he would get preferential treatment from his master. So those are some of the cracks in that institution. But I'll tell you what, you take a rebellion like Nat Turner's that happened in the same year William Lloyd Garrison is publishing The Liberator up in the north. It also happens at the same time that a nearby state, South Carolina, is seeing the United States Navy point their cannons at the harbor to make them enforce that tariff, that tax we talked about. The South felt like their whole way of life was being threatened by angry, rebellious slaves, by Yankees who didn't know any better, by the United States government. They felt like their backs were up against the wall, and their paranoia was only mounting. And that paranoia is going to explode before too long. Now, if we're going to look at the South in all its complexity before the Civil War, there's one really interesting final piece of the puzzle that we got to look at. See, I mentioned to you guys a little while ago that there were free black people in the South, even during the time of slavery. There were about 250,000 free black men, women, and children, some of whom had been slaves, but who have been set free, some of whom have been born free and just happened to live in the South. So not every black person was a slave. But it gets really interesting if you look at this just for a second before we end this video. Of course, since they were African Americans, Southern states didn't treat them as equal. They actually made, I think I mentioned this before, you had to carry freedom papers if you were a free man to prove that you were not a slave. You had to register with your state government as a free person. You actually weren't even allowed to leave your state. If you were a free black man or woman in Georgia, you lived in Georgia. You couldn't travel anywhere. They didn't want black people traveling state to state and communicating and organizing resistance. One Southern judge used an old term, I don't know if you know what a caste is. It's like a really rigid social class that you can't get out of. A judge in the South said, even free black people have to realize they're from an inferior group. They're from a degraded caste of society. They are not equal. They may not be slaves, but they're not equal. That's what the Southern authorities believed, right? That's what they're preaching. But this may blow your mind. Free black people were allowed some rights that other white people enjoyed. We're not talking voting, of course, but some free black people were allowed to own property. And think about how far you could take that. Maybe you're already seeing where I'm taking this. If a black man can own property, what kind of property has the South been defending in this whole discussion? Yeah, there were African American slave owners in the South. Not very many, a small number, but there were some. And of course, it gets more complex. I mean, for example, one of the laws that free black people had to follow was if you owned slaves, you were not legally allowed to set them free. White slave owners could set their slaves free if they wanted to. Black slave owners could not. So what sometimes happened was, you know, a black man may be legally a slave owner, but all he had done was raise some money and bought his relatives from a white man so they wouldn't be his slaves anymore. Legally, yeah, they were his slaves because he bought them and he couldn't set them free, but he didn't necessarily treat them as slaves. But there were some black men who owned slaves and treat them as slaves. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what does. Bottom line, guys, history is complex. It's not cut and dried. It's not easy. And in our next video, we're going to see how complex and how messy this is all going to get. We're going to take the growing anti-slavery movement in the North, the argument about defending slavery in the South, and we're going to bring those things together. And that's where I want to take things with you guys next time. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.